All right, another Bellows Blades review here. Today we're going to be looking at a Benchmade, specifically the Benchmade Griptillian. This is my first Benchmade knife that I had gotten, and so it kind of has a special place for me in my knife collection, and I'll go into that a little bit more here in a bit. But just wanted to take a chance to kind of take a look at this. Now, I know with the Griptillian, this is a knife that many in the knife community are very, very, very familiar with. So a lot of reviews, I'm sure, are already out there on this knife. Many of you probably already own this knife. But I felt like since I'm going through and kind of doing reviews of the different knives that I've received over the years or new knives that I've picked up, I gotta at least cover the Benchmade Griptillian. So now this particular model here, you can see is the Benchmade 551-1 Griptillian Blue Class. They have the manufacturer date there for 2021, and this is the one with the CPM 20 CV blade. So that is what we're looking at here for this particular knife. And you can see I do like the color scheme on this one. It's got the gray G10 with the blue liners, and we'll go into that a little bit here too. Now, the first thing that I want to just go over just real quickly is the specs on this knife. So this knife overall, when it's opened, is 8.07 inches from the tip to the back here. We're looking at just a little over 8 inches. The blade itself is 3.45, so for all practical intents and purposes, this is a 3.5-inch blade, which is kind of, I find, a sweet spot for the everyday carry style of knife. Just looking here at a couple of other things. This knife is a fairly light knife for as it feels fairly light for as kind of thick and chunky as it looks. It's 4.17 ounces. The blade steel is the CPM 20 CV, and I'll get into that a little bit more here in just a minute as well. And they say that they harden their CPM 20 CV to 59 to 61 RC on that. So pretty hard, pretty high hardness in that blade steel, the way that they heat treat and temper that blade. So overall, there's not a lot really that I could probably say about the Griptillian that people who are familiar with knives wouldn't already be aware of. This is kind of one of Benchmade's workhorse knives. This is one of the knives that they're very, very well known for. A lot of people who aren't familiar with Benchmade, you know, a whole lot anyway, are still going to be familiar or at least have heard of the Griptillian or the Mini Griptillian. This is kind of one of their bread and butter knives. So as far as the knife goes itself, those are the specs. You're looking at 8 inches overall, just under 3.5 inches for the blade. It's got G10 scales on it, gray with blue liners, and weighs 4.17 ounces, so fairly light. Okay, all that being said, take a moment here to kind of talk about the blade steel on this one, because that's kind of what sets this one apart from some of the other Griptillians out there. Is this is the CPM 20 CV, and of course that is kind of a higher end steel. It's a really well balanced steel. It has great edge retention, but it's not so maxed out on the edge retention that it loses toughness and all that. So this has decent toughness, decent you know, corrosion resistance. It's fairly stainless, and still has good edge retention and you know, wear resistance, things like that. So really a very balanced steel, and I gotta say, I do really like the steel that this is in. It can be a little bit difficult to sharpen. I will say one thing about this knife is I was a little disappointed with how sharp, or how maybe not so sharp, it came out of the box. I would have expected, being again my first Benchmade, I kind of had higher expectations based on the price point of their knives and their reputation, what I'd heard. I was a little surprised that it wasn't sharper than it was, so I did kind of polish the edge up a little bit so that it could at least shave with it, because it was not shaving sharp out of the box. But other than that, you know, I do really like the blade steel. It holds an edge for a good while, and it is just a well-balanced steel overall. Again, they say that they harden it to 59 to 61. as far as the hardness on that. Of course, I can't really verify that without sending it away, but that probably sounds about right. And I can just say that it does hold an edge fairly well. So all of that being said, what is the intended use or purpose of this knife? This is definitely meant to be an everyday carry knife, just a workhorse style knife. It's got a right, size blade for most of what you would end up needing an EDC for. It's got a very usable blade shape as far as the styling of the blade itself. Ergonomically, it feels really good in the hands. Their handle scales here are just shaped really well. I like the slight rounded aspect to them. It really fits the hand well. Sometimes a lot of blades have very flat scales. These are fairly flat, but they have just a little bit of rounding where they kind of bulge out a little bit in the middle, and I think that fits the hand better. You've got the jimping here in the liners and then on the back of the blade here on the thumb ramp, so you can get a good grip on that when you're cutting. That works really well. Of course, their axis lock is something that they're well known for, and locks up pretty tight. I will say that I have heard of people having the Omega spring in here on the axis lock break. Of course, I've not encountered that at this point, but I have heard that that is one of the downsides of these, is that those can break, but I haven't run into that, and hopefully I don't. I do really like the color scheme on this. I like the gray. I like the blue liners. I always think having the different colored liners just adds a little bit of a splash of color there and just really makes the knife pop. So I like that. It does have a fairly deep carry pocket clip that is reversible for left or right hand carry, but it is not reversible for tip up, tip down. This is only a tip up carry knife. So if you're somebody who likes to be able to reverse that, or you like tip down, this is not going to have that capability for you. Overall, my kind of thoughts on this knife. So obviously, like I said, the intended use or purpose for this knife is definitely just a workhorse, everyday carry knife, right? And that's honestly, most of the pocket knives probably that I review on my channel are going to end up being in that category or that use. But as far as this one, I will say that it hasn't seen a lot of time in my pocket, and I'll go over kind of why that is. So one thing I do really like about it first is the action is extremely, extremely smooth. That thing is completely drop shut. You open that axis lock and you can just see how smooth that is. In fact, a lot of times, and this is kind of one of my complaints about it, I've kind of gotten away from thumb studs. I've gotten so used to the Spidey hole and to flipper knives that it just doesn't feel natural for me to use a thumb stud anymore. And that's on me. That's just because the knives I've been carrying have been one of those other two kind. For years and years, I only carried thumb stud knives, and that's what I preferred. So, that's a personal choice. That's nothing wrong with the knife. It's not a ding on the knife itself, but it's one of the reasons it probably doesn't rotate into my pocket a whole lot. And the second reason, and probably the bigger reason that I don't utilize this knife as much, is because it is a fairly thick blade. And I've gotten used to more slicey knives that have a full flat grind like Spyderco does on a lot of their knives, are really thin behind the edge knives. And since I'm no longer working, back years ago when I worked a lot of heavy manual labor and stuff like that, I really beat up a knife. I preferred the thicker knives because they could stand more abuse, and I feel like this would fit that pretty well. And back when that was my life, I probably would have carried this more often. Now, unfortunately, in some ways fortunately, in other ways unfortunately, for using knives, it's an unfortunate thing. I have a desk job, so I don't really have to utilize a knife real heavy all the time, and so I don't care so much to carry those thicker, kind of chunkier bladed knives. And so this one, I feel like with the blade geometry and it being as thick as it is, it's not as slicey as what I'm used to. And that's not to say that you can't utilize it, that it won't cut. It clearly will. You can get this thing razor sharp and it's going to cut. But it's just a little thicker behind the edge, and then of course only having the grind halfway up the knife here, not having kind of that full flat grind. It's just not something that I prefer to carry right now. So for that reason alone, it's not that I don't like the Griptillian. I love the way it feels in the hand. I really do. It's super, ergonomics are spot on this thing. I'm not a big fan of the blade design, blade shape, blade design, geometry, all that. Um, Again, really good knife though. You can see that by its name that it's made for itself in the knife community. So I'm not really dissing the knife. I understand that this is a good knife, and I do agree with that. And I think if you're somebody who having the thumb stud and having that style of blade is not something that's going to bother you, then I can highly recommend the knife. That being said, all that being said, one of the things I will say is this is still one of my favorite knives in my collection, and the reason for that is this was actually gifted to me. And it was my first Benchmade that I'd ever had. I hadn't bought one just because of the price of Benchmades. And a lot of their designs don't appeal to me visually. I just had never bitten the bullet and put down the money to buy a Benchmade. So this was gifted to me from somebody I'm really close with, and so it has a lot of sentimental value. I really appreciate the gift. It was a very thoughtful gift, and again, just because it was my first Benchmade and who gave it to me, I will carry this thing from time to time, and but I do kind of baby it as well for that same reason. So it hasn't seen a lot of hard use. I do know it's got great steel in it. I know it'll hold an edge. I know it's a little difficult to sharpen because I have done that. Overall, though, it's a great knife if you're just getting into Benchmades, especially if you're somebody who needs kind of a heavier duty everyday carry knife. I can highly recommend this. Like I said, action-wise, you can just see how smooth that action is on this thing. In fact, I've gotten, because I don't like the thumb stud, a lot of times I'll just flick it open by using the axis lock, just releasing it, flicking it open, and letting go with that instead of flicking it out with the thumb stud. And there is really not a lot of blade play on this thing. I could tighten it up a little bit and remove any at all. There's just the slightest amount as it is, and that's how it came out of the box. I didn't adjust the tension on this thing at all. I could, I just haven't, because there's not enough blade play there to really bother me. And I do like how smooth that action is, especially with it being a thumb stud. I'd rather keep it that smooth, so if I do use the thumb stud, it's easier for me to flick that thing out. So as far as that goes, you know, those are kind of my thoughts on it, recommendation on it. Yes, I still highly recommend the knife as long as you understand what purpose it serves and how it's going to function. Again, this is an everyday carry knife, and I consider it more of a heavier duty, a heavy use everyday carry with the blade design that it's got on it, the thickness of that blade. This thing is made to be able to kind of withstand some abuse when you're using it. And it's made out of a steel that should be able to stand up to that abuse as well. So that's my thought on the Benchmade Griptillian. You guys sound off in the comments if somebody has carried one of these, and I'm sure there's a lot of you who have, who's carried it as an everyday carry and actually used it quite a bit. Let me know what your thoughts are on it. Do you have any issues with the thicker blade design? Or, you know, what are your thoughts? Like I said, ergonomically, I think this thing feels great in the hand. That is one thing that I will give it right away. It immediately feels really good in the hand. And I do love how smooth the action is. I'm not overly a fan of the blade shape and geometry on that blade. But other than that, this is a great knife. And again, like I said, if you're going to use it for hard use, I highly recommend it. Especially if this is your first foray into Benchmade. You really can't go wrong. They have a lot of other great knives you could get, but you really can't go wrong, and I don't think you're going to regret picking up a Griptillian.